Hey man, get yourself over to Alpha Draft and play some of that fantasy esports. Okay, that ends the Jamaican introduction to the show. Since NA, North American CSGO fans, are in a dry period at the moment where no team's made a round of 8 of a major in like 5 tournaments. So there's been 4 in a row where there's been no one in the playoffs who was an NA. Obviously, this isn't a great time for NA. Yeah, there was the summer where Cloud9 had those second places, but it's been a while, realistically, since a North American team could compete for a major and really be considered a favourite and actually, obviously, even win a major. So I want to take people back in time of Counter-Strike and go back to the early 2000s when there was a team, X3, Extreme 3, where the players in this team not only were, at one point, one of the best teams in the world, contended for championships, but the core members of this team would make up the great teams of the next 2 to 3 years, going from 2001 through to 2004. They would be among the best teams, and they would win majors, and they would win big tournaments and be contenders. So this is a story about this great, great team, which, funnily enough, was made up of some of the first players to be extremely good in North America at Counter-Strike. So X3 as a team itself, some of its core players were seeded from a team beforehand, actually 2 teams, but eventually they all combined into one. 2 teams called NHG and CK3. CK3 standing for Clan Killers 3. And players like Bullseye, Moto, Rambo, K-Sharp, all at one point in time played on the CK3 lineup. And towards the end, and actually, I'm not sure if Rambo did. I know Rambo was on Riot Squad and then later Syndicate, which finished 5th place at a CPL in 2000, Babbage's. And they would make the super team lineup they make some of the players join CK3 altogether, and then eventually they'd make the super team lineup, which became this X3 team. And X3, the first lineup, was Moto, who'd been with them, K-Sharp, who was considered coming into his own as one of the best players in North America, but mainly online. Rambo, who was definitely one of the best players even on LAN. Big Dog, who arguably was the best player in North America at the time. And Bullseye, who was a good player who'd been with a number of these players in different teams. So that was the 5-man lineup. At the time, overall, the best 3 NA players were K-Sharp, Rambo, and Big Dog. So this was a super team they'd put together. And the problem with CK3 was it had been one of those older clan teams that had like old guys in it. And it was like used to play 7v7 back then. Now we were in the 5v5 era. So in 2001, this team as X3 Blue, because they had 2 lineups in this team in this tournament, they had a red team as well that actually had Fatality on it, went to Speakeasy CPL, which was an unofficial tournament at CPL, and it was one that was put together with Valve. It's actually one of the first places that they demoed HLTV, even though I don't think it actually was on for this tournament. And in this tournament, the team win this tournament in very dominant fashion. And in the final, they beat Xeno, who actually had a guy called Recon, who would later go on to win World Cyber Games that year with LND, who was a Canadian team. So they won this tournament. They were on top of NA. This was a tournament where NIP, Heaton, Potty, those guys had chosen not to attend this because they were in like some sort of a down period at the time. I can't remember the reasons why. Now, shortly after this tournament, Moto left the lineup. He'd wanted to be the leader of the team. He'd wanted the team to have strategies. He felt like this was the way they were going to have to play when they did face a team like NIP and they faced them at the next big tournament. The rest of the team didn't want that. They were already on top. They were already winning. They were playing a free-for-all style. So they were like, if you want to be the leader, if you want to go tactics, just go somewhere else, mate. There's no place for you in this team. So he left the team, and instead they got in Porter, who'd previously been a Riot Squad member. Alias at the time was Chameleon. And in June of that year to early July, there was a tournament, like a 3-day tournament, called the CPL 4-year anniversary. And at this tournament, X3 won the tournament, and they had they beat Domain of Pain in the final, which was Moto's new team, and they won this tournament. And then in September of that year, they would play CPL Invite, which was a small tournament that the CPL did, which is an invite tournament at their offices with 4 of the top teams that all happened to be around the Dallas area. And in this tournament, shockingly, X3 actually lost. They lost to Moto's Domain of Pain team. Famously, Kane had an amazing game on Nuke and went ham. Then in the final, X3 reasserted themselves. They won the tournament, so they were undefeated in North America in terms of tournaments. They were clearly the number 1 North American team, and they went into the big major of that year, CPL Winter, which had $50,000 for first place. They went into this tournament as the favourites from North America. And because they'd won everything in North America, and over in Europe, NIP, Heaton, Potty, those guys had won everything. These were the 2 teams everyone wanted to see face. Now, admittedly, the NIP lineup was slightly different at that major. They brought in Vestlin and Arl, Al from Game Online, Vesselin from Mafia. Whereas the lineup that had won everything had been with Executor, but these two lineups were the ones everyone wanted to see face. And online, there was a massive war of like, who would win? Nip, X3, oh no, I think X3 will win, K-Sharp will wreck, Heaton and Potty will wreck, K-Sharp and Rambo. It was all over the place, and everyone was waiting to see it. And they were the number 1 and number 2 seed. And at this tournament, they would meet in the upper bracket final. No one else could beat them. In the upper bracket final, NIP won on Train using Vesselin instead of Al. Lower bracket, X3 makes it through to the final. They even beat Game Online. In the final, they play NIP, they win the first map. And I think the first one was the overtime game on Nuke. And I think this was the one where K-Sharp went crazy and had like 27 kills or 30 kills. It was a very memorable game. Mainly all with the Colt, actually, with the rifles, not with the AWP, which is what he's more famous for online. And in the last map, though, the second map, they would lose 16-14. A crazy scenario where NIP won this really close game. And so NIP prevailed, but X3 had been right there competing for that championship money. Moto's NIP DOP team, unfortunately, only finished 8th at this tournament. And overall had been considered a failure for what they could have done. They'd been considered the second best North American team for quite a while. Now, in online play up to that point, X3 had also been undefeated. They'd won the first 2 seasons of like the Domain of Games League and the first 2 seasons of Cal Invite League. And they came into the Season 3 final right after the CPL Winter, and they were playing Domain of Pain. But at this point, Moto had left. He'd gone and joined TSO, who'd finished, like, I think, 5th at that CPL. And they played in this final on Dust 2 Online, and shockingly, they lost. So this really big streak of online wins they had, here was a key loss in the final to a team that actually was like a new DOP lineup with, like, Sniper XX and Exile in it. Moto's TSM team would then go on to do other things. He would bring Kane into the lineup, who'd been his former DOP teammate. And so now you'd see where they weren't just the good team themselves, but they were seeding the other teams. Because in the next invite season of online play, X3 would fall apart. And in fact, K-Sharp would even leave. He'd go play with Darkside. Rambo would leave. He'd go play with Riot Squad briefly. Eventually, before the season ended, they formed Team 3D, which would become the next big squad of this lineup, which had Bullseye, which had K-Sharp, which had Rambo from the X3 lineup. But elsewhere, the story was now about Moto's TSO team, because that concept he'd had that they should have real tactics and a real leader, he'd implemented in TSO. And this team, it was a team that had good team play, not so much skill, good team play, because they had a bunch of players who were friends for a long time, and they'd done decently at that CPL, better than his DOP team. So he'd come into this team and he brought Kane in for the skill aspect, and that he knew this guy could compete on LAN. Now he had enough skill, now he had the tactics, now he had the team play, now the team would listen to him, and they did all of his strats, and they were one of the best tactical teams of their era. And as an individual player, he was inspired, he was possessed to want to beat X3 and be the best NA team. So he was playing fantastically himself. He was playing at a superstar level himself. And they managed to go undefeated in this Cal Invite season and even win the tournament completely. And so they went into the next CPL as one of the favourites. But because Team 3D had formed during that season, they hadn't competed in that league. So everyone was wondering, how would Team 3D be? And Team 3D was K-Sharp, Rambo, Bullseye from X3, but then they brought in DeBears and Jaden, who were two like up-and-coming players who finished 9th to 12th with Elite Underground at the last CPL. So CPL Summer 2002 arrives, the next big major in North America. And at this tournament, people are expecting big things out of Team 3D, and they crash out in really upsetting fashion. They get upset by this Australian team. No one thought Australians were good at the time, because they actually weren't that good. On Cobble, where the Australian team had this crazy bug no one knew, where you could throw smokes and flashes over the skybox into the B site and just get them all in there before you had to come in. So they were able to do this, exploit it, and beat Team 3D. Team 3D then lost to MTW Germany in the lower bracket. MTW Germany admittedly was a good team. They'd finished second silver medal at the World Cyber Games in 2001, which admittedly didn't have a lot of the elite teams because they were all at the CPL at the time, but had some good teams. They were shockingly upset by this team on Aztec, and they played really poorly, and famously, Jaden and DeBears kind of choked on LAN compared to how good they'd been online. And so it was a massive shock that these guys finished 17th to 24th when they were used to always finishing first or top 3 or worst, like top 8, worst case scenario. So a massive shock. Meanwhile, again, the focus was on Moto's TSO. They came close to really doing well at this tournament. They were one of the favourites. They only managed to end up finishing 5th, but in the upper bracket, they played SK Scandinavia, the team that went on to win the tournament, that had Heaton and Potty, Executor, these guys from NIP, and they managed to be really close to winning. It was on Train, and they did really well on their, I think on their CT side, they were like 9-3. Moto went ham with the AWP and was going absolutely crazy. But then they choked on the second half in terms of terrorist side play. And two factors. One, Moto's just choked in terms of like, he was so frustrated with how it was going badly that he just stopped calling. And so instead came to Churn, a guy where he was formerly called RJ was his alias, and he'd previously been in PAG and then DOP briefly. And it turned to this guy who'd formerly been in game leader to take over calling, and he just called the same strat over and over again in terms of attacks, and it just went to shit. SK was a very skilled team, and SK just won nearly all the rounds from there on out, except for like some crazy save. And as a result, SK won the match 13-10. It was really disappointing, and you could see the team had fallen apart. Then in the lower bracket, they played DOP, the former team of some of these guys, and then they lost to those guys on Cobble, a really disappointing game where they got totally overrun, and as a result, finished in 5th after beating Infinity Esports, formerly 4Kings, in the 5th place decider match. So still 5th place, a good match, but you'd seen, even though Moto had the team with the tactics and all that, it'd fallen apart a little bit because some of the players weren't as clutch on LAN. Some of the players were choking. He needed more of that veteran aspect that 3D had, but they didn't have the tactics, they didn't have the structure. They had some chokers. So you could see there was an obvious destiny that these guys should reunite. Another factor of why they lost at that LAN as well, it has to be said, is because they wanted to practice at this Churn guy's house in Plano, Texas, they'd agreed to let him on the team, even though he hadn't been a part of the lineup that had gone undefeated. So kind of a silly move there, but that's the sort of crazy shit people did at the time in these days. So Team 3D brings in Moto again. They kick out De Beers, they kick out Jaden, they bring in Moto to be their in-game leader and implement strats on them because they've been humbled and realise they need him now, seen how well he's done with like a lesser players. And they bring in Steel as well, who'd been very good in Gamers X and had also won the World Cyber Games at the end of the previous year. And they brought in Kane from TSO. So they have a really super team right here. And Moto sets about putting tactics in place. They win the World Cyber Games qualifier. They go to the World Cyber Games, which is the first they could compete in because all those players have been playing in CPLs beforehand. World Cyber Games is in Korea. And at this tournament, they do really badly. They lose to Mouse Sports of Johnny R. They lose to the French Good Game. They lose to even... and so as a result, yeah, they only finished 7th place at this tournament. So it's actually a disappointing start. But jet lag, a lot of them have never experienced jet lag. They're having to play with a new lineup. They're having to adapt to this aspect. And some of those teams had fantastic runs. Like Mouse Sports was very good at that tournament. And Good Game had this guy called Sniper, who was an AWPer and just went ham on Dust 2. You couldn't have expected. And they were one of the best French teams, obviously. The next tournament, though, would be the major. It was CPL Winter 2002. And we're talking about a year after the NIP vs X3 Winter tournament. So at this tournament, the favourites coming in, Eolithic. Fantastic team, best team in the world. SK Sweden has a new lineup. Game Online has this superstar Nordic all-star lineup. In the tournament, they beat all these NA teams, first of all, including Domain of Pain, who had like Destruct, etc., and Exile. They beat all these guys coming up to it, so they've like taken care of the fact that they're the best NA team. Then they play SK Sweden on Nuke, the map obviously that the X3 guys had lost to them famously when they'd been NIP, that core. And SK Sweden had 3 of those players. They had Heaton and Potty in full form, but then they had Medion who'd come back out of retirement over that year to play for this one tournament. So they had 3 of the core of that team, and they had 3 of the core of the X3 team that had played them the year before. So it was a revenge match. But actually, Team 3D would win this game fairly easily. I think it was like 13-7, and this was the game where they had Steel sitting out and Kane was playing, and it was just a really good performance. Rambo was particularly good in this game. They won that game, and so in the upper bracket final, they played Game Online. And this was on Inferno. They used Steel for this match because they were using a 6-man rotation, and they used Steel on Inferno. Steel went ham. They won this game over Element's Game Online lineup that also had Hib and Soul Edge in, and Missa and Vicon, and they were up into the final. Now in the final, it would end up meeting Game Online because SK Sweden lost a close game on Inferno to Game Online, so Game Online gets back to the final to play them. This time, Steel goes out the lineup. They bring in Kane because it's going to be on Dust 2. And this is a game where they win it in close fashion. Game Online does a bit of a comeback. This is the game where Rambo does the famous "Whose org is this?" when he picks it up around the double doors on Dust 2. And yeah, this was a fun game because in this game also, this is where Team 3D helped to innovate something that hadn't been seen very often, which is when they lost the pistol round on T side, on second round, they bought Deagles and they just camped inside the upper dark area of B on the T side of Dust 2, so that when the Game Online players pushed into this area, they were waiting with their Deagles aimed, killed them, and won this eco and managed to turn the game on its head outside. So they were able to win that map, didn't have to go to a second map, and won the CPL. So they'd won a major. A North American team won a major in Counter-Strike. So they were the de facto best team in the world. Now next year, I think it was April, they would attend Click Arena, which was the next big tournament. It was in Europe, and it had them flying over to it to try going to Europe. Unfortunately, in this tournament, they lost a number of big games that were in shocking fashion. They lost to Level, which was this Danish team that had Vicon in them, lost in shocking fashion on LAN there. They lost a Game Online in a revenge match. Admittedly, Game Online didn't have Element at the time. He'd gone to Eolithic, but they still had Missa, Soul Edge, Hib, a bunch of really good players. They lost, I think it was on Dust 2 there as well, a revenge match. They got into the playoffs after beating the Korean team, And in the playoffs, they got mega upset by Euphoria, a Spanish team no one had heard of, but who had this one crazy player who at the time we hadn't heard of called Musambani, who was crazy at this tournament. And he managed to put Team 3D out of the tournament in 8th place when they were expected to contend and actually considered the world's best team coming into the tournament. The tournament would eventually be won by Vesseland's Team 9 Esports United lineup. They went back home. And because of Click Arena going to shit and being held in really terrible circumstances where it was all pushed forward and delayed, then played out really late at night and all over one day, and then no one got paid any prize money, they were too wary to go over to France for ESWC. And ESWC ended up being one of the great majors in CS history, but this was the first one that they were holding. It was in France, and it had a similar kind of, it sounded like it was going to be a Click Arena type event. It turned out to be much better, of course. So they didn't go to this tournament. Instead, they chose to attend an NA LAN called Killer LAN, where I think first place was $10,000. So obviously, only NA competition. They're thinking they're going to win it. Problems happen, though, because they go to this LAN. Admittedly, they had no K-Sharp. Instead, they had Steel and K and all. They didn't have any K-Sharp at this LAN. They lose twice in the final to Tech, which was a Ludes clan. Formerly, that team had always been online. But more importantly, Tech also had De Bears and Jaden, who were out for revenge. So they win this LAN, beat 3D, and 3D has to finish second. And actually, because they don't win the 10,000, it was almost a waste of time not to have gone to ESWC. So at this point in time, after the LAN, for extracurricular reasons, they cut Kane from the team. And they just have a 5-man lineup of the other 5 players. They go to the next major, CPL Summer. And at this tournament, they have a really great run. They beat 4 Kings in this amazing game, an overtime game on Mill, where they actually would have gone out of the tournament if Bullseye didn't win a 1v3 with the Deagle against the 4 Kings players. They win that map. They managed to beat Advanced Online Losers, who at the time had Johnny R, this very good AWPer who'd formerly been on Mouse Sports. They beat those guys. I think that was on Nuke. They go to the upper bracket final again, so they're guaranteed a top 3 finish. They play SK Sweden there, who has Element in it, who has Potty, who has Heaton. They have this amazing team. They lose to SK very narrowly. It's 10-13 on Inferno. And at times they were doing well in this game. SK takes it narrowly. Okay, lower bracket final, they have to play Team 9, Vesseland's lineup. But Vesseland's team's now got Executor, formerly of Eolithic, and they've just won ESWC. It's a Dust 2 game. It goes to overtime. And the guys from Team 9 managed to edge them. And so they finished third, just 3D, but in the most heartbreaking fashion. They really could have made the final on this, maybe even won it under other circumstances. It was a very good performance by them, very close losses, and they have to finish third overall. The WCG USA qualifier for that year, they won again. This time they beat Rival in the final. They go to World Cyber Games again, obviously where they'd failed the year before. And this time, after a contentious match against the Brazilians, MIBR, who were just starting to come into their own, but hadn't quite come into elite status. There's actually a game that had a flash bug on Nuke that Moto was able to rules lawyer and benefit from. They beat Level in a revenge match, the Danish guys. And in the final, they played SK Sweden. At this point in time, SK Sweden has Spawn in the lineup instead of Element because it's a national tournament. It's World Cyber Games. SK Sweden was unbeatable in this tournament. They were stomping everyone in this tournament and hadn't lost a single map the whole tournament, and they didn't lose a map in this final. There was a close game on Train, which was a 13-11 game, where Team 3D had won the first half 12-3 or something, then on CT Train, and then SK won 13-2 on CT Train and won the game. The second map wasn't close, and as a result, SK won the gold medal, but Team 3D wins a silver medal at a major. So still an elite level team, still showing a good representation of North American skill level, and they were much above the level of all the other NA teams at the time. At CPL Winter, which is the major, a few months after that, they're coming in obviously as the number 1 seed because they've won CPL, they finished second at WCG. Unfortunately, this was the first big failure of this particular lineup. And this core, beyond the Team 3D era when they'd failed at the first CPL together, this was the first time with all these good players that they really fail. Because they lose to United 5, actually Moses' team, but also Fraud's team, more importantly. They lose to them on Mill. Moto had a very poor game. He kept hiding in the sewers and kind of baiting his teammates. They lost to MIBR and Inferno. MIBR got revenge for World Cyber Games. This was the tournament when people started to really get to know about MIBR. They started to show off that they were a good team. And so as a result, they finished outside of top 8, which is unheard of for elite level teams. They finished 9th to 12th. And you could already tell there were problems here. Part of the problems, they had a really good salary. They made $1,000 a month, which is a lot of money back then. They had this great sponsorship. They used to fly everywhere. They used to do a lot of promotional stuff. But as a result, they got a bit cocky. They didn't want to recruit new players. They thought they were all onliners or hadn't proved themselves, because nearly every player in this lineup had been great from day one in Counter-Strike and had been the elite players from the early CPLs on. So they didn't believe in chokers. If you choked, they thought you were just a choker forever. They didn't realize Not everyone was as great as you at the beginning. Some of them had to work into the position online. So they never recruited people like Dominator. They never believed in people like Sunman. They thought people like Fraud were too cocky. They wouldn't recruit these players to their team. They stuck with that same lineup and thought, no, it'll work out. And since they, in theory, on paper, in terms of their names, was still a super team, they thought it would all work itself out. Also, around this time, started to be friction. Moto's in-game leading wasn't as good, so now they were going to let Bombs have a go, and Rambo would have a go. But Rambo got a bit paranoid because he was the best player, but people weren't doing as well on his team, so he had to start to bait people a bit to try and be the last alive and be the lurker. And he was very good at it, but he sometimes went a bit too far over the line with that. So 2004 was the year it really all went to shit. They went to the ESWC qualifier. They wanted to go to ESWC this time because they knew it was legit from the year before. And Zex, the second best NA team for a while, had come second there. So they knew it's a tournament we want to go to. Unfortunately, they couldn't even qualify. Because at the qualifier, they lost to TSG, which was a bunch of the ex-Zex players, like Sunman, and actually had Dominator and a bunch of these players. Then they lost to Rival, who at the time had been a bunch of online players, but now they'd shown they were pretty good on LAN as well. This was one of their first breakout tournaments, and Fear was very good. And so they didn't even finish top 2 at this tournament, and they didn't get to go to, didn't even finish top 3, in fact, didn't go to get to go to ESWC again. They went to Everlan a few months later, which was a tournament where they would only finish 5th to 8th, shockingly. They lost to Tech again, a slightly different Tech lineup in the group stage, and they lost to United 5, which was actually a De Beers team this time, with Hair and Fraud, etc. And this was quite a shock. And United 5 were going to finish second. I think finished top 2 in the tournament, actually, because how the bracket went. And yeah, this was shocking. And this is where Moto was playing pretty poorly. The team was in absolute disarray, and they just looked like they were just hanging on for the salaries at this point in time. The next major, CPL Summer 2004, they have their worst ever finish. They finished 13th to 16th. Now, they did lose their first game to Eyeballers, Hyper's team and Vilden's team, who went on to win the tournament. And this was a close-ish game. I think it was a game on Nuke. But aside from that, what was really shocking was they lost to Evil Geniuses, an all-Canadian lineup, where their best player was Stevenson, but they were best known for Stevenson being great, the rest all being his friends, and not being that sick a team overall. They lost to that team, didn't even make the top 12, and lost on Train, I believe. And so this was very shocking. It's okay to lose to I, but to lose to the other ones, that's unacceptable. And this just showed how far they'd fallen. Now, towards the end of the year, they started to have better results. They finished second in an online GGL Invitational tournament where they lost to Unite 5. They were still showing online they were very good. They were always still making like finals of Cal Invite, making top 4 of Cal Invite, although not actually winning many Cal Invite tournaments anymore, which perhaps shows the seeds of the fact that they thought they wouldn't try, or it didn't matter if they lost to lesser players, or were in denial that rising players were good. WCG qualifier comes up, they get it all back. They win the qualifier again, 3rd straight year. They beat United 5 in the final, who arguably were better in some ways. They go to the World Cyber Games, and at this tournament it was played amazingly only at the final in CS Condition 0, a slightly modified version of 1.6, where, for example, grenades did like mad damage. Oh no, I think it was like CS:GO actually. The grenades didn't do much damage if they were like behind a wall or something. So it was slightly different, but it was still most of the mechanics. They have a miracle run at this tournament. In the semi-finals, they beat SK Sweden 2-1, and they have that amazing game on Inferno where Moto gets boosted and drops behind the box on the bomb spot at A, and everyone runs after him on a pistol round, and he kills all 5 of them, and he has this amazing round. They win this game. In the final, they play the Titans, who had been one of the best teams of that year, who'd won ESWC earlier in the year, and he had young Wimp, who was an absolute phenom. In this final, Volcano plays great. They beat them 2-1. They win the gold medals. Another major. Admittedly, not in 1.6 technically, in CS CZ, but similar enough to 1.6. They win the major there. So the second major, final of like a 4th major, depending on how many you're counting. And beyond that, a few months later again, we have CPL Winter, another major of the year. Unfortunately, at this one, they don't do as badly as they did before, but they only finished 8th at this one. This was the one where they had Bombs in the lineup. They'd actually needed Bombs, obviously, to play at World Cyber Games because Steel couldn't play there, and obviously couldn't play the year before, which is when they'd used... Who would they use for 2003? I think they'd used Bombs as well for 2003, but they'd just gone back to his team, if I'm remembering correctly. So CPL Winter, unfortunately, this one, they lost to Gamerco, which is the team formerly known as Rival. And obviously, there'd been a lot of shit talking between those teams. Losing to them was okay. Then they lost to Big Grip, which was actually Khan and DSN's team. So, interesting loss there. Big Grip did go on to be very good. And interesting, that was on Mill. So, it was another killer loss on Mill. Actually, maybe it was the Big Grip game where Moto kept going in the sewers. I think he did in both of them, to be fair. People had got very paranoid in the team at that point. And then in the 7th place decider, they lost to Death is Eternal, who were considered like the 4th or 5th best NA team and considered onliners and just bullshit SoCal team who were all puggy and just played like morons. So losing to them in the 7th place was a real wake-up call. It's like there's something wrong with the lineup. Steele retired right after the tournament. He hadn't played most of the games except the ones early on. And from there on out, the lineup would gradually dwindle one by one. Like K-Sharp would eventually retire like a few months. Like Moto would go out the lineup a little bit. They'd bombed CPL Barcelona. They only finished like tied at the ESWC, which I think Moto wasn't in the lineup for. Or maybe it was Bombs was out at that point in time. Gradually the lineup fell apart. Eventually it would only be Bullseye. In fact, Bullseye had already left at the end of that year as well, and he'd gone off and he made he left in 2004 and gone off and eventually became part of Complexity. That's what had happened. Bullseye had left the lineup. They had Bombs instead. And they got Volcano for 2004. That's right, instead. That's when Bullseye left, they got Volcano. So it was obviously Bombs they'd used for the World Champions before, who joined the team. And in 2005, basically what happened was you had players coming in and out of the lineup, and it would end up really, K-Shop would retire, it would end up really only being Rambo of the lineup that stayed, because there was no Bullseye, K-Shop's retired, Moto's gone. Yeah, that's it at that point in time. And essentially, Moto would come back in again in 2006 and give them some good results, help them win Land War. I think that was when he came in, and then make top 4 at the ESWC 2006. So they finally had a good ESWC finish. Then he would retire not that long after that. So you can see how they really played a monumental role throughout the history of North American Counter-Strike. But you can see they had a number of majors where they did very well. They won a couple, and they had top places in them, and they were legitimately representing North America very well in terms of usually being the super team, the best players, having some of the best performances, and having very good placings, even though they did have their problems, and in a very American fashion. Too much money, too much sponsorship, too much leisure, not dedicated enough. Wanting to have strats, not wanting to have strats, losing faith in their teammates, playing selfishly, all kinds of problems, shit-talking people, not wanting to pick up people they thought were chokers, not good enough or hadn't earned their respect. Those players then beat them and go beyond them and overtake them as teams. You can see all the problems in a very American fashion that you've probably seen in the modern-day NA CSGO scene. So let's describe the team, shall we? So, okay, I said in the early days that Big Dog was the early player, best player in CK3. Then it was like K-Sharp and Rambo took over in most of the X3 period as the best players. Then Rambo really was the best player around like 2002. But Moto became very good, then rejoined the team. Then in the latter days, Rambo was the best and became a very good player leading right through 2003-2006, but became a bit more selfish. K-Sharp dropped off a lot on LAN. He would be very hesitant to AWP, and he would just become a passive rifler and not an impact player like this crazy, amazingly skilled online player that he would be, who was just a dominator otherwise. Then you would have scenarios where Bullseye lost some of his form. He'd mainly just been someone who never had good skills, but he could frag and he had a lot of clutch ability on LAN. Then he went off to Complexity. Moto really lost his drive, and as his in-game leading went, he really just lost a lot of his will to play until he came back in 2006, was decent again. And so the thing about X3, when they were actually X3 before 3D, was they were a free-for-all 100% team. As in, they just all went to whatever spot they wanted on the map and just took aim duels and beat everyone. And they were so skilled at that point in time, because it was before 1.5, it was 1.1 and 1.3, one player, if he was really dominant, could just take over a whole game and win it himself. And they had 3 or 4 of those players who could do that. So they were just shitting on opponents. They would rarely ever lose a game in the online season. Usually on like weird custom maps. Like when they lost on DE Rotterdam to, who would it have been? Or might have been another type of map. Maybe it was CS Rotterdam to Domain of Pain, actually, Sniper XX's team. And they lost a Cobble game to DLP as well, but otherwise, basically, teams could almost never beat them. They tied a game on Inferno against Tau. I can remember too much shit, it seems. They not only were a free-for-all team like this, but because of that, K-Sharp was in his element. Because he was a player that if you put him in a structure, wasn't as good. If you let him go free-for-all and just move around the map, he was like a Guardian-type player, which went mental. Back then, they hadn't changed a lot of the factors about 1.5, that they changed to 1.5 where they made the spray more random and they made the jump down, cool down more, so that you couldn't jump as much as quick, so you couldn't dodge as much, there wasn't much air acceleration. And so pistols weren't quite as good. And so as a result, K-Sharp stopped being this same monster that he was. He was amazing, no-scope, quick no-scope. They made the scope take longer to come out and re-scope. Rambo always was very well-rounded. He became one of the god lurkers, very good at damage output, very smart in 1v1 type situations, good at understanding what the enemy would do, calm under pressure. They had very skilled lineups throughout X3, and obviously later on in 3D with some very good lineups, but then people caught up to him, and the game became so that you couldn't be as far ahead individually. In 3D, Moto was the in-game leader. He was a very good in-game leader early on, taking what he had from TSO. Rambo was very much the MVP of CPL Winter 2002. Like I said, K-Shap fell off a bit. So you can see the seeds of how these great players, this core, affected all of North American Counter-Strike for the first 4 or 5 years. And then later on, it would come to complexity and fraud to take over. And then in the latter days, Evil Geniuses of Lurpus, Fraud, Nothing. But you can see how North America wasn't always a team that was on the outside looking in. They were very much a part of it in these days.